Don't forget to land, measuring project success. In this lesson, you are learning to distinguish the difference between a project launch and a project landing. Let's focus here on the difference between launches and landings and how to ensure that your project will be completed successfully. You will often hear companies celebrating the launch of a new product, service, or initiative, and it is important to remember that even when your project is out in the world, your work isn't complete. When working on a project, the goal isn't simply to launch it, but to land it. Landings occur once your project achieves a measure of success. As project managers, landings are what we strive for and what we celebrate. They are the ultimate reward for all of our efforts. Launching versus landing a project. In project management, a project launching means you have delivered the final results of the project to the client or user. You can't solely base project success on when the client accepts the project, though. Your work on a project won't be complete until you land it by thoroughly measuring the results. This is when the success criteria and the metrics you defined initially when setting SMART goals will come in handy. Teams should be clear on what they are trying to accomplish, beyond just launching something to users. Will your project increase retention? Will your project speed up a product feature? Depending on the product and situation, the answers will differ, but it is important that your team aligns and works toward the same measurable goal. Launch first, land later. Let's consider an example. Imagine you are a project manager for an eco-friendly organization. Your organization asks you to create a training program for middle school students in your county to teach them about the impacts of recycling. The county's goal is to increase recycling by 20% over the next 5 years. You gather your team and start developing the learning content to build out this training program. It takes you and your team 1 year to complete the research, development, and production of this training. When you hand over the training to the school district, you are launching the project. In order to know your project actually landed at the intended goal, you need to check back in periodically over the next 5 years to see if the training program is on target to produce a 20% increase in recycling in the county. Launch and forget. A common mistake of many project teams is to launch and forget the results. This happens when a project manager delivers the project to the client and the client accepts the project delivery, but the project manager doesn't assess if the project deliverables satisfy the customer or user. In the example above, if you didn't check back periodically over 5 years to assess the results, you would have only launched but not landed the project. Launching and landings work in tandem to ensure true success. A project landing shouldn't create more hurdles. If done correctly, a landing creates greater alignment within the teams on the end results you all desire, and it gives everybody on the team better visibility on how to achieve success. Key takeaway. Launching your project to the client can be a very big moment for you. You handed over the project to your client and now you can take a step back and breathe. But make sure you land your project, as well. Look over your notes, talk with your team, meet with the client, and remember to return to your intended deliverables and metrics to help you measure success. Same project, different perspectives. Andy Jordan, July 31, 2019. One of the biggest frustrations I encountered in my early days as a project manager was that conversations with different stakeholders never seemed to clarify matters, they just made things more complicated. That was because each stakeholder had their own views of what was important, what needed to be done, and what success looked like. I had a tough time reconciling those different positions in a way that would allow me to manage the project effectively. I know there were times when I just shrugged my shoulders and focused on what I understood to be important, and I also know that approach frustrated some of my stakeholders and reduced their belief in my abilities. What causes this environment, and as a project manager what do you need to do about it? As a new PM, the biggest gap in my understanding was that I didn't appreciate that this was a perfectly normal situation. My projects tended to start with the sponsor sitting down with me and walking me through the business case, explaining why the project was being done and why it was important for the business. I assumed that if that was the sponsor's position, then that would be the position of all key stakeholders. I understood that different stakeholders would focus on different things. Resource owners were more concerned with the work their people were doing than the overall project, for example, but I didn't expect different interpretations of the project fundamentals. But that's exactly what happened. Every project manager is faced with this situation, but for new PMs it can represent a more significant challenge. That's because they don't have established relationships with the project stakeholders and they don't have a sense of the natural bias, approach, etc. that each of those stakeholders has. The new PM likely also doesn't understand the inevitable political environment that sits below the surface and impacts some stakeholder actions. Of course, new project license to Google for training use only. Managers also lack the experience to confidently balance conflicting perspectives from different stakeholders. Understand, assess and adapt. I believe that there needs to be a three-step approach to dealing with these situations, and the same approach can be applied whether it is your first project or if you have been managing projects for years. It's just likely to become more of a subconscious effort with experience. Those 3 steps are: 1. Understand A. What is the position each stakeholder has? 2. Assess A. How does that position compare with the organizational view of the project? 3. Adapt A. Adjust elements of the project to manage any variance between views and perspectives. Let's look at each of those in turn. First, you need to understand each stakeholder's position. That isn't just what they think, but also why they think it. For example, if the customer representative doesn't believe that some of the features should be included, why is that? Is there a sense that it adds nothing to the solution, or did the stakeholder lose a debate over what should be included and are now trying to reopen those discussions? You also have to consider another element to gain complete understanding of each stakeholder and their position relative to other stakeholders. As a simple example of what I mean by that, it's easy to understand that resource owners are concerned about what their resources are doing. The finance representative is focused on how much money is being spent, and what it's being spent on, and the customer is focused on the end product. Each of those roles will create a different view of what is important, and that can easily lead to conflict in the event of challenges on the project. That's a natural segue to the assessment piece. Once you understand those different perspectives from different stakeholders, you have to determine which stakeholders carry the most weight and which ones must be viewed as more peripheral. The natural assumption is that the sponsor is the most important stakeholder and that their position is the baseline for the project or the perspective that all other stakeholders are compared against. In many cases, that's true, but it doesn't mean the sponsor is without bias. Sponsors are often looking to leverage the success of the project for their own gain, and that may even have been the driver behind getting the project approved in the first place. While the sponsor likely has the most accurate assessment of the project at the start, be prepared to assess their motives if the project experiences challenges along the way. You must assess the motivations, biases and perspectives of all stakeholders throughout the project, because that is what drives your actions. The adapt piece of our 3 steps. Let's start by stating what adapt doesn't necessarily mean. It may not require changes to how the project is managed. There will be occasions where different positions taken by stakeholders licensed to Google for training use only are an attempt to influence how the project is delivered, and that is something you must consider in the assessment piece. However, on many occasions, all that is required is an adjustment to how you communicate to those stakeholders. New project managers can easily feel overwhelmed by the number of things they have to do, and as a result they look for ways to save time and effort. Often that results in a single, rather brief, status update being provided to all stakeholders in the project. That's unlikely to satisfy anyone's needs. It is a generic update that doesn't address the specific needs of individual stakeholders. Instead, you need to tailor communications for your audience here, focusing on money for the financial stakeholder, concentrating on the work that their team is doing when communicating to resource owners, etc. New PMs also often fail to provide context, or they may provide the customer with information about the end product, but don't explain why changes have occurred, how problems are being resolved, etc. The bottom line: if there's one thing I've learned in my project management career, it's that stakeholders will always find new and innovative ways to frustrate you. Sometimes it's deliberate, often it isn't, but they will always be one of the most challenging aspects of project delivery. That's unavoidable, but if you focus on understanding what they need and why they need it, assess their motivations and respond appropriately, you'll go a long way toward creating a satisfied set of stakeholders. Tracking and communicating success criteria. 2 rulers form a right angle. Within the angle, 3 jagged, ascending lines are shown, with a star on the top. We recently covered the topic about launching and landing projects, and now we will turn our focus to ensuring that our landings are successful. Recall that SMART goals are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, and help keep a project on track for success. We can also determine the success of a project by the quality of the product, the ability to fulfill the needs of your customers, and the need to meet the expectations of your stakeholders. For this reading, we will discuss these particular success criteria, the metrics we use to track them, and how and why we communicate our findings. Product quality. The product, or final result, of a project has its own set of attributes that define success. The product attributes that are necessary for the product's success include completeness in features, quality of features, unit cost, usability, etc. The extent that a product is complete will contribute to the product's success. This can apply to any project in which you deliver a product or tangible outcome at the end. To keep us on track for success, we can create a list of product requirements to ensure that you do not miss anything. For example, if the project produces word processing software, you need basic features like text entry, formatting, saving, and printing. Since you require each feature to have a functional word processor by today's standards, you include these features on your checklist. To measure the success of a product, consider including these metrics on your checklist. Track if you implemented the product's priority requirements. Track and assess the product's number of technical issues or defects. Measure the percentage of features you delivered or released at the end of the project. What is important to the customers or stakeholders? We have to pay attention to product metrics, but we also have to be mindful of stakeholder and customer additional expectations for features and objectives. In the word processor example, a stakeholder may want to add an additional functionality to easily create tables in a document with text. Additionally, a strategic goal of the organization could be to create word processor software with more collaborative ability than the word processors currently on the market. Each component is necessary in order to meet customer and stakeholder expectations. Think about what needs the project satisfies for your stakeholders or customers. These strategic goals tie back to the business case and the reason you initiated the project in the first place. Often, you can measure the fulfillment of strategic goals via user or customer metrics. Metrics to consider include evaluating user engagement with the product, measuring stakeholder and customer satisfaction via surveys, tracking user adoption of the product by using sales data, document, align, and communicate success. Understanding where we are and where we are going helps the project team determine if they are on track. As you learned in the video on this topic, you need to get clarity from stakeholders on the project requirements and expectations. There are many people involved with any project, and success will look different for each of them. You want to ask questions, such as, who ultimately says whether or not the project is successful? What criteria will be measured to determine success? What is the success of this project based on? It is best practice to get the key stakeholders or the steering committee to review and approve your success criteria. This becomes a mutual agreement on how all parties define the success of the project. Key takeaway. Remember, all projects encounter change. All parties must have continuous access and alignment to the success criteria agreed upon to avoid scope creep, uncontrolled change of the project's scope, or failed expectations at the end of the project. It's important to document success criteria upfront and continue to report on it throughout the project. You can make a copy of this document to help you get alignment or download it here. Check out the attached article about how to manage the expectations of stakeholders when defining success criteria.